Somewhere in the Bible, there should be one clear story about how Satan fell from heaven. There isn't. Instead, the two most famous Satan's fall passages in the whole Bible were originally written about two human kings. Neither passage even uses the name Satan. Piecing together how ancient taunt songs about foreign kings turned into the origin story of the devil is one of the strangest puzzles hiding in plain sight in Scripture. This video will answer 3 questions that most churches never fully explain. First, where does the Bible actually describe Satan's fall from heaven, word for word? Second, why do the two most quoted Satan passages never even mention his name? Third, how did later readers turn these passages into the origin story most people think is written clearly in the text? By the end, it will be clear how much of the popular Satan story came from connecting separate dots across many centuries. It did not come from one single clean narrative. Here is why this matters. Almost every modern idea about Satan comes from a small handful of verses. That includes the idea of a beautiful angel named Lucifer, and the idea of a proud being cast out of heaven for rebellion. Most people have never read those verses in their original context. Once that context is clear, the whole picture changes. Start with the word Satan itself. In the earliest Hebrew scriptures, Satan is not a proper name. It works more like a job title. It means something close to the accuser or the adversary. In the book of Job, a figure called the Satan appears inside God's heavenly court. He acts like a prosecuting attorney. He questions whether Job's faithfulness is real or just a result of an easy, blessed life. In the Book of Zechariah, the Satan shows up again in a courtroom-style vision. This time he accuses a high priest named Joshua. In both stories, this figure works inside God's own court. He answers to God directly. He is not yet the independent evil mastermind that later tradition describes. The earliest Hebrew Bible treats him more like a courtroom role than a supervillain's name. Now here is where the real mystery begins. The passage most people picture when they think of Satan's fall is Isaiah chapter 14. This chapter contains a taunt song aimed at a fallen king. It calls him Hillel ben Shahar. That Hebrew phrase means something close to Shining One, Son of the Dawn. Ancient scholars later translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin. They rendered that phrase as Lucifer, meaning light bringer. That name eventually became attached to Satan in later Christian tradition. But look closely at the actual text. Isaiah 14 opens by directly naming its subject. It says the entire taunt is against the king of Babylon. The chapter describes a human ruler's arrogance. It describes his violent conquest of nations. It describes his humiliating death and the corpse left exposed. Nowhere in the original passage does the text claim to describe an angel. Nowhere does it claim to describe events in heaven before the creation of the world. Many scholars believe Isaiah borrowed imagery from older Canaanite myths, stories about a minor god who tried to climb a sacred mountain and got thrown back down to earth. Isaiah then reused that dramatic imagery to describe exactly how far a human tyrant would fall. The second major Satan passage works almost the same way. Ezekiel chapter 28 contains a lament aimed at the king of Tyre. Tyre was a real historical city, and its king was a real historical ruler. This passage describes someone who once lived in Eden. It calls him the anointed cherub who covers. It says he was blameless until wickedness was found in him. That language sounds far more cosmic and angelic than Isaiah's passage does. But once again, the chapter directly states at the start that this lament was written for the king of Tyre, a wealthy and arrogant human leader. Scholars note that ancient Near Eastern kings were often described using exaggerated, godlike language. This was a common literary style at the time, not a claim of literal biography. Ezekiel appears to use that same technique here. He compares an arrogant human king to a glorious being cast down from paradise because of pride. So if both famous passages were originally about human kings, how did they become the origin story of the devil? The answer involves centuries of later interpretation. Early Jewish writings outside the official Hebrew Bible, including a text called the Book of Enoch, began developing much richer stories about rebellious heavenly beings called Watchers. These stories were popular around the time of Jesus. even though they never became part of the official Hebrew Bible. Early Christian scholars picked up this same trend. A highly influential theologian named Origen, writing in the 3rd century, began reading Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as hidden references to Satan's original fall from heaven, buried underneath the historical descriptions of the two kings. Once that interpretation caught on, it spread widely through Christian tradition. Eventually it became the default way most people understood these two chapters, even though the original Hebrew audience almost certainly heard them very differently. The New Testament adds its own pieces to this puzzle, without ever fully resolving it either. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus makes one brief, striking statement. He says he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He does not explain when this happened. He gives no detailed account of the event itself. In the Book of Revelation, a vision describes a war in heaven. The archangel Michael and his forces fight against a dragon. That dragon is identified as the ancient serpent, the devil, and Satan. Michael's forces throw the dragon down to earth. This is by far the closest thing the Bible has to an actual battle scene for Satan's fall. But Revelation is written in vivid, symbolic imagery. It describes a vision, not a plain historical timeline. Even here, the text never directly connects this scene back to Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28. Readers made that connection themselves, centuries later, weaving 3 separate texts into one continuous story. Here is something that rarely makes it into the shorter versions of this story. The name most associated with Satan's fall, Lucifer, only exists because of English and Latin translation choices. It comes from the Latin word for morning star. That is simply the word the Vulgate translators chose for the Hebrew phrase in Isaiah 14. Centuries of English Bible translations kept that Latin word in place. Eventually, Lucifer got treated as if it were Satan's actual given name straight from the original Hebrew text. In reality, that word never once appears as a name for Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. It is a Latin translator's word choice for a poetic insult aimed at a Babylonian king. Over time, it took on a life of its own that the original writer never intended or imagined. Even the serpent in the Garden of Eden follows this same pattern. Genesis chapter 3 never once calls the serpent Satan. It never even calls the serpent evil. The text simply describes the serpent as crafty, more cunning than any other wild animal. It tricks the first woman into eating forbidden fruit, and it receives a curse for doing so. That is the entire description. Centuries later, the Book of Revelation looks back and calls Satan that ancient serpent, directly linking him to the Genesis story for the first time in the Bible's own pages. Until that late reference, nothing in the Hebrew Bible explicitly says the Eden serpent and Satan are the same being. Readers filled in that connection themselves, the same way they filled in the connections between Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation. There is one more twist worth knowing. Many scholars believe the Hebrew Bible's picture of the Satan grew more detailed and more independent over time, partly through contact with other cultures during Israel's exile in Babylon and Persia. Early on, the Satan looked like a loyal member of God's court, simply doing an assigned job. By the time later Jewish and Christian writings were composed, the figure had grown into something far more independent, rebellious, and evil. That shift did not happen overnight, and it did not happen in one single verse. It happened gradually, across centuries, as different communities added new layers onto an old and much simpler courtroom character. So here is the full picture, once all 3 sources sit side by side. Isaiah 14 mocks a human king's downfall using the imagery of a fallen star. Ezekiel 28 mocks another human king's downfall using the imagery of a fallen guardian cast out of Eden. Neither passage claims, in its original setting, to describe an angelic rebellion. Centuries later, Jewish and Christian readers combined these poetic taunts with Luke's brief statement about Satan falling like lightning, and with Revelation's symbolic war in heaven. Out of those separate pieces, they built the origin story most people now take for granted. The Bible never actually tells this story in one place, start to finish. It was assembled, piece by piece, out of poetry written about 2 very human, very arrogant kings. That means the most famous fall from heaven in religious history was never actually written as one story at all. Make sure to subscribe and turn on your notification bell if you want more content like this, and comment what you think.